Arrival by John Charters. Read by Colin Baker.
The world-shaking news was carried simultaneously by every wire service. Within hours, there were few human beings who had not heard it on television or radio, or seen the giant headlines in every language. "Message from outer space!" screamed the New York Mirror. "Aliens contact Earth," informed France's Paris Soir. "Is it a hoax?" asked the Times cautiously. Each editor vied to set up the biggest, heaviest headline of all time. The stock exchange in every country wavered, rising and falling as panic selling was replaced by shrewd buying. The first contact had been made around 3 in the morning at Mount Benview Observatory in California, where two sleepy but enthusiastic junior astronomers were completing an infrared study of a distant galaxy, using a high-powered VHF instrument to measure the bounce-back. It had suddenly developed an intermittent clicking, which had sounded like Morse, but made no sense to the technician who remembered enough from his early training. The same sounds had been picked up by various radio hams around the world, but mainly ignored as being undecipherable or in a foreign language. The frequency seemed to alter, as if the transmitter was seeking a contact. At Mount Benview they had noted the disturbance in their logbook, only because it was unusual for their instrument to pick up transmission on such a high frequency. The next morning it was played back on the tapes, and a senior technician cautiously suggested that it was not possible for it to have come from Earth, or even one of the satellites. He talked mysteriously about warping, but no one took him very seriously. At 4:25 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time the next day, a hoarse voice was picked up in various parts of the world on a short wavelength. It might have been taken for a hoax, except for the remarkable fact that every person who heard it, be he English, Russian or Chinese, heard it in his own language. A rapid checking between the countries showed that the voice had spoken at the same moment everywhere. The text, as recorded in most countries in each language, said, "Now feel we on correct sound band for your star is that planet, Earth. Language translator not perfect, yet some mistakes. We are from galaxy, star system, very long, far from you. Have picked up your transmissions for many, cannot yet understand your time bands. We feeding in computed information and complex machine improving translation now. We come in peace. Request your pleasure. Correct to permission to land and exchange information. If not granted permission, will continue on our journey. Now have understood your time band. Will you transmit answer in 24-hour units from now, using your shortwave coordinates? Computer complex indicates our name to you is KPOC." The voice was gravelly and slow, with pauses after every few words as if the next phrase was being studied before being read. Assuming the whole thing was not a gigantic hoax, which did not seem practical in view of the broadcast by the identical voice in every language, it appeared that the world had 24 hours to make up its mind if it wanted to play host to an alien race. The hotlines burned between the leaders of the world. Every nation, large or small, was entitled to have its say, and the United Nations delegates in New York prepared for an all-night sitting. The usual cranks caused the usual minor panics, which always occur during world crises. Pundits were summoned to chat shows on television. Experts appeared in news programs and interviews, all giving their studied, serious views for and against. But inevitably, The answer must be yes, land. It was unthinkable that such an opportunity could be ignored. Nevertheless, the governments of the world were cautious. Suspicion, ever present to politicians, lurked in every cautious phrase. Are we so naive that because these things from outer space claim to be friendly, we must believe them? Bellowed a red-faced senator in a television interview, aware that since there were no wars going on, his shares in a camouflage clothing factory had nosedived recently. We must sound the alarm, a call to arms. Be prepared to face this ghastly invasion with the courage and fortitude which our soldiers have always shown in time of war and strife. By noon of the following day, the Secretary of the United Nations Organization announced that no decision would be taken yet. Before permission was given, a further exchange of greetings might be helpful. It was pointed out that the strangers, friendly though they might be, could be carrying germs which, while harmless to them, could be fatal to humans. It was considered a splendid piece of political indecision. After minor squabbles and attempts at one-upmanship, it was agreed to send the answer on 2 different wavelengths, one in English and one in Russian, from Washington and Moscow. At 4 p.m., the vast IBC station broadcast. This is the planet Earth calling our visitors the K-Pox. We speak in friendship, but with wisdom. Before a landing is agreed, we would wish to know more about you, just as you should learn more about our ways of life, our beliefs, our science, our society. If you have monitored our sound waves and can understand our languages, we would request an exchange of information before contact is made. We stress again, we speak in friendship. Can you indicate what distance you are from us and consequently when you expect to be near us? The world waited breathlessly for an answer. Was it all a hoax or a bluff? Were they really friendly? The fate of the human race might depend on the next message. 24 hours later, the answer came, again seemingly in all languages, although this was now explained. The voice had improved its quality and had almost a chatty resonance. This is the K-Pox spaceship calling Earth. We have received your friendly message and meanwhile have adjusted our computers to converse with you so that your basic tongue will hear our signals and understand them. This process we will show you, and Earth people will be able to communicate without a language problem. We agree to exchange information, although it seems our telemetric vision is far more advanced and your receivers will be unable to pick up the picture. This can be rectified upon our arrival when we will give you this formula. Difficult for us to judge distances, as we have no means yet of comparison of lengths. Our ship is about 200 times the length of one of us. From our monitoring and computer calculations, it seems we have similar bodies in many ways. We walk upright, on 2 appendages as do you, and have 2 arms, although you appear to have only 1 elbow. Also, we do not have what you term a thumb. This was not for climbing trees in your past. We are, of course, telepathic, which we imagine you will soon become. Your civilization seems on the brink of a major breakthrough, a wonderful era for you. We expect to arrive at your planet in about 6 of your weeks, as far as we can judge your timescale. By the time we receive your reply, we will have stepped up transmission so that we can answer immediately. The K-Pox send you greetings. To the average person, this easier and casual exchange was hugely reassuring, and the promise of new formulas and advanced inventions excited the experts. The delegates at the United Nations were more relaxed. and the threat of an invasion from outer space now seemed pure science fiction. At top level, the news was reassuring. It seemed that their spaceship was about 1,200 feet long. Big, yes, but no more than an ocean liner. Within a few hours, IBC and Moscow drafted their reply. World leaders encouraged by your sensible answers to our requests. We anticipate, after further exchanges of information, we will be in full agreement to give permission to land. We suggest each day that time is given to our scientists, politicians, society leaders, ministers, doctors, and other prominent citizens to broadcast our views and request similar information in exchange. Immediately the world heard this message, there was pandemonium. The leaders of the nations, now all comfortably installed in New York with their retinues, realized they had made a mistake. Firstly, the more serious followers in most countries considered the broadcast was smug and pompous. It was felt that any race which had the advanced technology to travel from star to star, staggering distances which could only be measured by light years, and whose computers could translate and emit information in every given language, should not be treated like an inferior, poor relative, being given permission to land. They should be made welcome now, and we should be humble in our approach to them, realizing they could alter our whole existence, said the experts. But the big mistake was in the last part of the message. From all over the world, telegrams and telephone calls poured into the United Nations. It seemed that every preacher and politician, every man of letters, every television interviewer wanted the chance to ask questions to the aliens, and unselfishly would be willing to come to New York, naturally with all expenses paid, to assist the human race in understanding the K-pox. The visitors, however, seemed unaware of any presumptuousness or pomposity on the part of the human race. Their replies grew more cordial as their computers were able to translate and relay every nuance of the spoken word, and soon it became obvious that many transmitters were being used throughout the world. As the days passed into weeks, a mass of information was relayed by the K-pox. Their home planet seemed to exist in a galaxy in the outer reaches of space, which not even the electronic eyes of Mount Palomar could pinpoint. Their life cycle appeared to be about 150 years. They did not have hair, and it turned out they had a third eye in the back of their cranium, as they did not have a neck. Doctors and anthropologists were astounded that despite these differences, the similarities in the two species were numerous. Even though the K-pox had two hearts, the blood pressure seemed to be the same, although always the computers were uncertain about size, except in proportion to a standard. In due course, the leaders of the world issued a friendly request to the K-pox to visit the Earth, which was received with cordiality by the visitors. The K-pox people have heard with joy your kind decision to welcome us to your planet. Within a few of your days, we should be within your star system, and already our course plotters have singled out your sun. We shall commence a gradual braking as our present speed in your terms seems to be many millions of miles per second. We would respectfully ask your theoreticians to provide us with coordinates which will allow us to land carefully without damage to your surface. Meanwhile, in answer to your previous questions on relative mass on our planet, after many consultations and a certain amount of good-natured bickering, it was surprising, however, how friendly and more cooperative the leaders of the world had become, it was agreed that the Penhurst racetrack would be the ideal site for the landing. Only a few miles outside the limits of New York City, it had flat, deserted country surrounding it, and would give an uninterrupted view to the hundreds of thousands of people who could be expected to watch the landing. The top engineers and scientists had been concerned that the method of propulsion of the spaceship might cause damage or pollution as it descended to land. the Kapocks put their minds at rest, although the learned men were no wiser. "Not yet possible to translate into your tongue the method of propulsion, as correct words do not exist. The nearest explanation our computers can emit is what you call magnetic. If you conceive two magnets, one being attracted to the other, the second being repelled, so that it is being pushed away faster and faster, but drawing the first one with it. There is no limit to the speed, and it must always increase. As for gravity, we use the same method top and bottom, adjusting the magnetic flow to compensate thrust and mass. It is very simple, and involves no fuel or implosions." This simple explanation caused considerable interest throughout the business world of oil, airlines, and every industry remotely connected with combustion or rocket propulsion. It could mean the end of an era, the approach to cheap travel, the termination of pollution from fumes. It could also mean expansion to the stars. The world waited breathlessly for the Kapocks' arrival. The density of entry into the Earth's atmosphere was carefully broadcast to the spaceship, although with their magnetic propulsion they could slow to a stop and then descend gently through the ionosphere. Latitudes and longitudes were explained, the Kapocks politely refusing the offer of radar and a homing beam, saying their scanners would bring them down exactly onto the target area. The Kapocks had requested a 12-hour break from midnight in order that the computers and themselves could concentrate on coordinates, and as they said, half humorously, to look their best upon their reception to Earth. They had explained that normally they only wore clothes as a protective covering, but out of deference to their hosts they were hastily fitting themselves out in what appeared to be skirts. A few minutes before midnight, the voice broadcast, "People of Earth, it is with solemn assurance and joy we report that we are now at a standstill above your beautiful planet. Although smaller than we expected, it is brilliantly coloured compared to our own. In fact, we have adjusted our—" and here followed a word that sounded like jinn— "to compensate for the brilliance. As arranged, we will descend for a landing at your coordinates exactly 12 Earth hours from now. It seems possible that your atmosphere may produce a static which will cut off communication for some time. Do not be alarmed. We will pick you up again before landing. Now we bid you our happiness, for on your tomorrow will be the first meeting of two great civilizations." The great day dawned. Instead of clear blue skies, there was a heavy mist and low clouds over most of New York State. A thin rain drizzled down on the vast involution of humanity, who, undismayed by the inclement weather, poured into the huge parking areas around the wide racecourse. Already, hot dog stands and portable kitchens were doing a sell-out trade, queues by the hundreds springing up for food, drink, periscopes, latrines, even an enterprising news sheet which purported to give inside information direct from the White House. Hundreds of thousands of transistor radios were switched on and at the ready, although stations had warned that there would be no further contact until only a few minutes before the spaceship landed. It had been agreed finally that the welcoming speech would be delivered by the Mayor of New York on behalf of the city and the world. If the President himself made it, protocol demanded that almost every representative of each country would claim a similar privilege. At 15 minutes to noon, with nearly every delegate miraculously in position, the gold and white helicopter of the President descended majestically on the racecourse in front of the beflagged grandstand. Mayor McMichael held his hat firmly on his head until the big rotors slowed. Formally, He shook hands with the president, and they strode up to the welcoming platform, the great man smiling and waving to the delegates. Seated on the platform in rows were the leaders, the ambassadors, prime ministers, and statesmen of all nations. Never had there been such a high-level meeting, thought the mayor ruefully. Microphones and television cameras were everywhere. It was the widest covered event of all time. It stopped raining, and workmen pulled back the awning over the platform in order that the dignitaries would have a better view of the descending spaceship. Everywhere one could see tense young men in well-cut suits. The FBI and CIA were out in force, searching, scanning, looking for any nut in the crowd who might decide today was bomb day. At a few minutes to 12, the speakers in front of the president crackled into life. On the special wavelength which had been agreed on, the Capox began transmitting. This is the Capox spaceship, welcoming the people of Earth on this momentous day when our two civilizations will extend arms to each other in perpetual friendship across space. We have begun our descent and already can see your beautiful lands below us. We are eager to explore the wide expanses of blue rock, which covers so much of... At this point, the static drowned the transmission. Mayor McMichael remembered the tense 12 seconds when the astronauts returned from the moon and radio transmission blacked out. Going to plan. Falling slowly and can feel your gravity. Similar. Estimate about 60,000 of your feet. There seems a grey smoke below us. Our scanners go through it. It cannot be mass. Perhaps a protective covering of some sort? The director of touchdown control spoke into the tiny microphone clamped to his earphones. Break radio silence. Tell them it's only clouds. They'll clear through them at 15,000. In a moment, control interrupted the voice on the spaceship. Earth to Capox. You're coming through a layer of clouds extending approximately 12,000 feet, but visibility under them is satisfactory. We should be sighting you at any moment. Our radar contact has picked you up. You're dead on course as you are. Thank you, Earth. We are descending now through a thick substance which our computers are... There was another crackle and the voice broke off. A great shout went up from hundreds of thousands of people staring upwards. Slowly emerging from the thick grey clouds came the spaceship. Like a gigantic silver airship, it sank majestically downwards, silently and smoothly. Its outline shimmered, giving a curious pulsating look, as if it was not solid. Inevitably, it started to rain, although no one cared or took notice. Every eye was on that gigantic silver shape as it sank onto the mile-wide green turf which had been cleared and marked. Suddenly, the speakers crackled into life. The voice came through, now hoarse and panic-stricken. What is happening? What are you doing to us? We are disintegrating. It was a trick. You are destroying us. We came in peace. Too late. Everything dying. To a stunned, unbelieving audience, watched by countless millions throughout the world on television, the mighty spaceship was melting. Like a gas bag with a leak, its beautiful symmetry sagging. Within minutes, the horrified crowd saw only a huge grey puddle spread over hundreds of yards, the rain relentlessly pouring down on it. On the world of the Capox, atoms and molecules had never known water. To them, the simple rain had been 1,000 times more deadly than sulfuric acid.
Nightmare by John Charters. Read by Peter Barkworth.
The quick and the dead. Somewhere in the long dark tunnel, the phrase came to him, nudging his memory, insidiously nuzzling his feelings. Like a puppy who's succeeded in climbing on the bed, but lacks the initiative to burrow under the sheets. He remembered some author's description of it, but it was surrounded by a hazy recollection, and he couldn't bring it into proper focus. There was a light shining in his eyes, which seemed, in his fuddled mind, to indicate he was still of the quick. On the other hand, he could be dead, and this was the start of something else, an afterlife in which he did not believe, an embarrassing refutal of his convictions, making a lie of his faith. Not that he was an atheist, an agnostic, perhaps, for he was a practical man with a trained, pragmatical mind who believed in nothing until it was a proven fact. Like the devil's advocate, he could regard himself without embarrassment or conceit as a brilliant man. The light was becoming stronger. He knew his eyes were closed, but the degree of whiteness was increasing, becoming almost unbearable. The need to open his eyes was overwhelming, but he knew if he did so, it would start a new chain of life. The quick or the dead. It was a decision he had to make. He opened his eyes. The light blinded him. It seemed to come from directly overhead, a searing mass of incandescent filament. He appeared to be lying on a narrow table. To his astonishment, he found his wrists and ankles were held tightly down. When he tried to raise his head, he became aware of a strap or restriction passing across his throat. He found he could not move. He closed his eyes again, thinking this out in the clearest manner he could adapt. Remembering he'd just regained consciousness, and therefore the cerebellum part of his brain would not be activating in the normal way. It would be necessary to have total recall before he could intelligently assess his present situation. Total recall. He squeezed his eyelids in a futile effort to remember. The thoughts flashed by in his brain, like a projector running at double speed, the images blurring with the effort, piling upon themselves and confusing the issue. With a conscious effort, he tried to wipe out all memory and start again. Cautiously, then. Do not strain the faculty, the convoluted mass of the vertebrates, those fragile nerves that record the ideas and impressions. Let them remain open, solvent. Let the impressions creep in by themselves, unaware of the strain and need of the mind. He lay there by sheer willpower, holding his brain open, until he realized he was forcing the very situation he was trying to avoid. Suddenly, he was partly aware. His memories and recollections flooded in, but the knowledge they conveyed did little to help his comprehension or perception of his understanding. Still, it seemed, his cognizance was lacking somewhere. Unexpectedly, he found himself angry. Whatever had happened had no right to impair his facilities to think. Yet here he was, flowing in a murky pool of incomplete reasoning. He opened his eyes again to concentrate on his surroundings. The glaring light was still there. He could still feel the restrictions of his bonds. A voice spoke, outside the bright circle of light. "You are conscious?" The voice had no tone, no inflection. It seemed to state an obvious fact without modulation. With difficulty, he forced words from his mouth. They came out reluctantly, like dry cornflakes, so that he hardly recognized his own voice. "Yes, I am conscious. Why am I here?" The silence bore down on him, in the same manner that the brilliant light seemed to flow right through him. He wanted to scream or beg them to turn the light away to give his mind some relief from the searing pressure. He closed his eyes, but the light flowed through his eyelids. There was no escape from the pitiless glare. Be calm, he thought. Be calm, and do not give way to panic. You know you cannot move, therefore lie still. Recall, discipline your mind to function again, you who always pride yourself on your scientific approach to any problem. Stop right there. Who am I? The cruel light made his senses dizzy for a moment. The memory banks of his brain clouding again, his recollections hazy, just out of contact with reality. Now a film, which had been developed but was without a projector, so that only tiny individual frames made sense. With a supreme effort of control, he steadied his nerve pattern. My name is Martin, he thought. Martin is my first name, but Martin what? Tantalizingly, a memory dodged in and out of his consciousness like a fluttering moth. He was playing tennis, an attractive girl laughing as he missed the ball. But the image shifted suddenly, and there was a hospital, a long corridor, and a stretcher trolley was being wheeled along. He seemed to recall the myriad of pipes lining the roof of the corridor. Again, the memory blanked over. If only they would turn out the light. With an effort, he urged his brain to convey a message to his vocal cords. The strap or fitting across his throat was tight and congested the cricoid cartilage. The words came out reluctantly, dry and unused. Turn out light. He screamed soundlessly as the blackness swooped in, blacker than anything he'd ever imagined, a deep, enveloping darkness which drowned him in terrifying successive waves of physical blackness, smothering him in blinding obscurity. The light returned, blessed in its brilliance, seeming to flood his brain with warmth after the Stygian black, his mind shuddering away from the memory. He tried to calm his mental processes, telling himself again and again that he was a scientific man, a man who did not panic, who controlled his thoughts and used reason and sense to assess his problems. Carefully, he opened his eyes again, wincing at the brightness, realizing that it was a whiteness of light with no source, as if he was inside a shining globe with no shadows, only the brittle, glaring white light. The voice spoke again, making words but totally without expression or eloquence. It is not dead. Convey that it will exist. Dead? Was he going mad? Had his brain snapped and all this was an illusion? Where was he? Who was he? The panic rolled back again as he tried in vain to make his mind concentrate. Abruptly, a memory flashed across the screen of his brain. Ridiculously, it was of a toasted cheese sandwich, browning on top under the grill, the cheese bubbling and melting. The image vanished again, and he was left with a sickening sense of defeat. He was aware that the metallic voice was speaking again. The induction will follow. In that way we shall have access to the Merimna, and you shall teach us your skills until such time as we decide your usefulness is ended. The words died away in his brain, and he became aware that the terrible brightness was being pierced by a shadow of thin darkness, like a gleaming needle, huge and shining and coming closer to him, growing in monstrous size until it was shutting out the whiteness, returning him again to that fearful dark. He cried out as it came towards him. Now he could see the point of the needle, tiny and enormous, in front of his eyes, coming closer, closer. Sir Martin Ponsonby, one of the world's most sought-after neurosurgeons, woke up to find his wife shaking his shoulder and scolding him. "Merci me," she said in the Scottish accent that even now still lingered. "I do declare you sleep like a log. Here's your tea. It's 6:30, and you're operating at 8, or have you forgotten?" He grinned up at her, loving the quaint lilt of the Edinburgh accent. Thank you, dear. I think I was having a nightmare. Oh, well, on with the show. As was his custom, he climbed out of bed and carried the cup of tea to the bathroom. He laid out his razor and commenced the ritual of soaping his shaving brush. At the back of his mind, he still carried the remnants of his dream. He peered in the mirror and wondered why he had a spot of dried blood exactly in the middle of his forehead.
Telemark 3 by Bob Shaw. Read by Rula Lenska.
Four days after the honeymoon, Ted Trimble came home from golf and found his wife had been unfaithful to him. The evidence was there, right outside his front door, for all the world to see. "Why did you do it, Maggie?" he demanded, setting his clubs down in a corner with exaggerated care. He kept his face immobile and his voice crisp, pretending to be not unduly shocked, though inwardly he was praying to hear it was all a mistake. But Maggie smiled her calm, careless smile and shrugged. "It was just an impulse," she said, "an irresistible impulse." Ted went to the window and eyed the evidence. The black turbo Cadillac was almost as long as the house, and its haunches gleamed in the late afternoon sun like those of a panther about to spring. So she was admitting it, just like that. "Maggie," he said reasonably, "everybody gets that kind of impulse now and then, but they just have to learn to control it." "I can't," she replied blandly. "When I find something I like, I buy it." "I see." Ted went into the kitchen, took a beer bulb from the refrigerator, and squirted some of the frothy liquid into his mouth. He sat down in the cool seclusion of the dining alcove to consider the matter of his wife's dereliction. Maggie's parents had left her a lump sum of almost $100,000, the income from which was just enough to maintain Ted and her in modest comfort for the rest of their lives. When they got engaged, the agreement was that the capital would be kept intact. Ted was a personable young man, and he knew he could probably have married real money, but he had exchanged his boyish hopes of someday owning a private airplane and yacht for the certitude of never having to work. And he had been prepared to stick to the bargain because marriage was, in his opinion, still a sacred covenant. The trouble was that Maggie appeared not to share his high sense of principle, for she had just blown a noticeable fraction of their livelihood in one afternoon. "I forgive you this time, Maggie," he said stiffly. "I guess it won't do any harm for me to be seen in a better car, but you must promise not to do it again." "Of course, honey." Maggie spoke with a lack of effort which Ted found disturbing, and she went on flicking the glowing pages of a tri-dye magazine. 2 days later, he came in from a morning's workout in the gymnasium to find that his fears had been well-founded. Maggie was sporting a bracelet of genuine green-veined Venusian gold, costing roughly 10 times as much as its counterpart in earth gold would have done. "I promised not to buy another car," was her defense. "This isn't another car, is it? It doesn't look much like a car to me." She flirted her wrist in his face, and the bracelet's chunky links clinked like the action of a well-oiled rifle. "It isn't a car," Ted agreed, "but it's something we can afford even less. What about our investments?" "This is an investment. Isn't gold an investment?" "Not that kind. Don't you ever read the financial pages? Don't you know that big nuclear-powered ships have just been provided out on the Venus and Mars hulls? The cost of Venusian gold at the moment is 90% freight charge, but by this time next year, it'll be as common as dirt. 3 days later, while Ted was surfing, she bought a luminous mink, costing as much as the car and the bracelet put together. Ted examined the price tag, then went into the kitchen, took a beer bulb in each hand, and expended them in a foaming orgasm of fury. When calmness returned, he went back to the lounge and greeted his wife with a numb smile. "It has just occurred to me that I've been neglecting you a little, Maggie. Let's go out tonight and see what we can do about hitting the town." Maggie's eyes flickered with enthusiasm as she hurried away to engage in lengthy cosmetic rituals, and that night she really did hit the town. When she was too full of assorted liquors to be aware of what was happening, Ted pushed her through the window of their third-floor bedroom. The fall did not kill Maggie, but the damage to her lower spine was such that she was confined to a wheelchair for life. As the Trimble's house was tall and narrow, with a steep flight of steps at the door, Ted felt that his wife was as good as dead. She could not, at any rate, get to the expensive stores in which she would be tempted to further acts of infidelity. With a minimum of prompting from him, she sold the car and the coat at a relatively small loss, but insisted on retaining the bracelet of green-veined Venusian gold. "What's the point of keeping it?" he pleaded. "I mean, you don't even go out now." "It's company for me, something I can look at." "But there must be more interesting things to look at. How about a television set?" To Ted's surprise, his wife showed interest in the suggestion. "If I sell the bracelet, will you get me a set?" "Of course, sweetie." "Any kind of a television set?" He sensed the trap immediately. But in his mind's eye he could see the big nuclear-powered ships speeding towards Earth with cargoes of cheaper Venusian gold, and he decided to play along. "Any kind of set you want, Maggie. You know how bad I feel about you being tied to that chair all the time." "That's nice of you, honey. I'd like a Telemart 3. Ted swallowed unhappily. He detested television as an opiate which sapped a man's strength of body and mind, and he even had an aversion to reading about the bewildering technical developments in the field. But he knew about the Telemart 3. The set was ordered that day, and Ted's unhappiness increased as he watched the technicians position the 8-foot proscenium and arch at one end of the lounge. Working with blunt efficiency, they ripped out the floor below the proscenium and ran a mass of cables, conduits, and waveguides down to the raw materials tank they were installing in the basement. 4 hours later, the job was completed, and a Telemart sales executive formally presented Maggie with a white and gold brochure. "This is your on-off switch and channel selector," he said, addressing himself intensely to Maggie and ignoring Ted. He moved to the switch, and a pretty girl in a silver dress appeared on the proscenium, singing in the low voice of a French diseuse. The only way in which she could be distinguished from real flesh and blood was a slight tendency to glow, which made her brighter than the other people in the room. "Oops," the sales executive said. "If the image is too bright, you do this." He moved a knob, and the girl dimmed to normality. "It's wonderful," Maggie breathed. "When do we get the commercials?" "You shouldn't have long to wait," the executive said benignly, his eyes gleaming behind their old-fashioned, horn-rimmed glasses. A few seconds later, the silver girl finished her song and vanished, to be replaced by a handsome, tanned man in beachwear. He was reclining on a sun chair on a shockingly real area of honey-coloured sand, and in his hand was a dewy, cold bottle of Tingle lime. Ted started involuntarily. He could actually smell sea air mingled with the keen tang of the soft drink. He examined the small orifices in the edge of the proscenium, looking for visible signs of gas being emitted, but saw nothing. "Why don't you join me?" the image was saying. "Join me now." "Shall I?" Maggie asked excitedly. "Only if you can use some tingle lime," the executive replied. "We urge all our clients to buy only what they really need." "We drink lots of tingle lime." "No, we don't," Ted put in, but he was too late. Maggie had pressed the accept button on her handset, and a crate of dozen king-size tingle limes appeared amid a faint ozonic crackling on the vestigial catwalk attached to the front of the proscenium. The executive lifted the crate, carried it to Maggie's chair, and with a flourish opened one of the plastic bottles. Maggie took it and sipped the green liquid eagerly. "It's perfect. Even better than the stuff we get at the store." "It ought to be. Anything you buy in a store is bound to have been on the shelves for some time, possibly months. But goods you buy through Telemart 3 are created specially for you on the instant of purchase." "Well, how can that be?" Ted felt he had been silent too long. "As I understand it, there has to be a crate of tingle lime at the broadcasting station. It gets scanned with Röntgen rays, and the details of its molecular structure are broadcast on a separate channel from the one which carries the programs and commercials, right?" "That's true, but if someone presses the accept button, the molecular blueprint coming through at that time is used to build up a replica of the transmitted object from the raw materials bank in the basement, right?" "Right again, but so how do we know the original crate of pop hasn't been lying on a shelf at the station, possibly for months?" "You know because the Telemart Corporation stands over its word as given in this brochure," the executive said in a hurt voice. He turned to Maggie. "I'm pleased that a tingle lime commercial was on when you made your first purchase because it demonstrates the superiority of the Telemart 3 over all other models. Believe it or not, a carbonated drink is not an easy object to transmit. With older systems, there was an appreciable loss of carbon dioxide pressure before the container was completely formed. But the Telemart 3 comes so close to instantaneous construction of the transmitted object that it is possible to—" "Oh, look!" Maggie interrupted. "There is a commercial for liquor chocolates. It's ages since I've had a liquor chocolate." Ted hurried into the ground floor room in which his wife had slept since her injury and found the bracelet of Venusian gold. He had a feeling he would need to get the best possible price for it. In spite of intensive bargaining and even a certain amount of abject pleading, he dropped over $5,000 on the bracelet. He went to his favorite gymnasium and spent 2 hours trying to work the tension toxins out of his body. But all the while a gloomy certainty that he had made a major blunder was building up in him. Finally, halfway through a set of deep knee bends, he made a decision. Maggie would have to give him a sacred vow not to use the Telemart for anything beyond normal household shopping. If necessary, he would even sit with her at nights until satisfied she was going to play the game. He showered quickly and drove home in his aging rotary-engine Pontiac. The tall, narrow house was in darkness, except for a dim, shifting light in the window of the lounge. Ted sprinted up the stone steps and went into the house, but he had trouble opening the lounge door. There seemed to be something heavy preventing it from moving. He got his head into the room and blinked incredulously at what he saw. Maggie was sitting close to the proscenium, watching a noisy powerboat race, but she was almost hidden from his view by a pile of cartons and boxes, most of which had been opened. In the first seconds, he picked out 3 new table lamps, a gilt-framed painting which looked like a Renoir, several of the recently developed 4-legged turkeys in polythene skins, a salon-type hairdryer, numerous hat boxes, and a deluxe Micropedia Britannica, complete with reclining chair and ceiling projector. Ted was unable to suppress a plaintive whimpering sound as he forced his way into the room. "You bitch!" he moaned. "You faithless bitch!" "What did you say, honey?" Maggie twisted a knob on the handset, and the sound of the jockeying speedboats faded away. She wheeled her chair round to face Ted, and he saw the Telemart brochure was open on her knees. "What do you think you're doing, Maggie? They don't give this stuff away, you know. Our bank account is automatically debited every time you press that button." Maggie shrugged. "You don't have to buy just what they show you in the commercials. Telemart offers all kind of services I never dreamed." She stopped speaking as he picked up one of the turkeys and hurled it at the vista of boats beyond the proscenium arch. The bird passed through a red boat, hit the wall of the room, and bounced back onto the floor. "I'm gonna kill you," Ted announced. "I'm a fair-minded man, and I don't like the idea of killing you, but you give me no choice." "You've been drinking." "I'm cold sober." He looked around the room, selected one of the new table lamps and removed its ornate shade, leaving himself with a serviceable blunt instrument. Maggie clutched the Telemart's handset to her bosom in a strangely protective gesture. "Don't come near me." "In a way, I blame myself," Ted said sadly, hefting the base of the lamp. "I should have known you weren't ready for the responsibilities of marriage." He stepped over a cluster of perfume bottles and swung downwards at Maggie's head. She twisted away from the lamp, and it crunched into the back of the wheelchair, tipping it over. Maggie went sprawling among the hat boxes. Breathing heavily, Ted stood over her and raised the base with both hands, noting with one part of his mind that she was still holding the handset, and was, in fact, twisting a red knob on it. Poor, mindless lump, he thought, as he brought the club down.
"Drop it right there, fella,"
a voice said close behind him. Ted spun and saw a hard-faced young man in a grey suit stepping down from the truncated catwalk attached to the proscenium. The stranger was holding an automatic pistol. "Who—" Ted's voice faltered as he tried to grasp the enormity of what was happening. "What is this?" The stranger smiled unpleasantly.
"You can't have studied the section of the Telemark brochure covering the new 3-star protection service for clients, lives, and property."
"Protection?"
"Yeah. As soon as we get an emergency signal, a trained security man who's on duty in the station is instantaneously transmitted into the home. And in this case, I'd say it made it just in time."
"But they can't do that." Ted had an overpowering sense of outrage. "After a while, there'd be hundreds of duplicates of you running about the city. Telemart can't go round creating extra people. We're overpopulated as it is." A shadow crossed the stranger's face.
"That's taken care of. They deliberately programmed a flaw into the hemoglobin structure of any duplicates they have to transmit. A massive embolism will kill me in a few hours. It's a hell of a prospect."
The stranger raised his right hand and leveled the pistol. Just a minute," Ted said desperately. "There must be some arrangement we can come to. I got money." The stranger regarded him with cold, tortured eyes.
"What good is money to a duplicate like me? I've got a short life, and all I can do is make it as happy as possible."
He aimed the pistol right between Ted's eyes and pulled the trigger.
In the Hereafter Hilton by Bob Shaw. Read by Dennis Waterman.
The apartment was neat, stylish and comfortable. Not at all like a machine designed for killing people. For a few seconds after the entrance door had locked itself behind him, Renfrew stood perfectly still, taking stock of the place, trying to identify the most likely sources of death. The kitchen, always the most complicated room in any habitat, was one area that obviously had to be avoided. Every particle of food and drop of liquid was suspect in case poisons had been administered. The appliances could have been wired in such a way as to electrocute the unwary user. and the bright-lettered canisters could be bombs which would explode on removal of their lids. Even the simple act of opening a cupboard door might release a cloud of instant-acting gas into his face, and one startled intake of breath would be enough to... If you want to stay alive, Renfrew thought, keep out of the kitchen. From his position near the entrance, he could see into the bathroom, and that also looked dangerous. Too many chromed fittings which could spring bad surprises. He was going to survive the mandatory 7 days in the apartment, of that much he was sure. But to do so, he would have to be fantastically careful. The best plan, the one he had already decided upon, was to make himself as comfortable as possible in the centre of the living room floor, and to remain there until the 7 days were up. It would not be easy or pleasant. The matter of bodily functions alone would see to that. But it was a straightforward choice between life and death, and Renfrew much preferred being alive. He walked into the living room and checked it out against his requirements. It measured roughly 10 by 10, had blue wall-to-wall carpeting, and was furnished with a good-quality settee, easy chairs and occasional tables. Several original paintings, restful abstracts featuring the exact blue of the carpet, adorned the cream-coloured walls. The room could have belonged to a youngish, intelligent, not excessively trendy person living just about anywhere between New York and Los Angeles, except for two atypical features. One was the complete absence of windows, and the other was the display tube built into the wall above the artificial fireplace. On the screen, in pulsing amber sans serif writing, were two words: "Jury out." Renfrew examined the room critically and decided at once that the largest table, positioned near the middle of the floor, would have to be moved against one of the walls to give him the clear central space he needed. When the room armed itself against him, as it was practically certain to do, he was not going to risk even the most fleeting contact with any of the artifacts it contained. For all he knew, every piece of furniture in the apartment would begin to ooze contact poison as soon as the jury returned the verdict of guilty, and he wanted to be sure he would not roll over in his sleep and touch something. The table was surprisingly heavy when he tried to move it, and for a moment Renfrew feared it was anchored to the floor. He changed tactics, pushing instead of lifting, and this time the table slid fairly easily, creating deep furrows in the carpet. When it had come to rest against the wall, he stepped back with widespread arms and gauged the size of the area he had cleared. It appeared ample for his needs. This seems a shade too easy, he thought, his confidence faltering. Nobody knew what percentage of condemned murderers actually lasted out a week. It was the practice, for humane reasons, to whisk survivors off to colony worlds in total anonymity and secrecy. But if the system could be beaten merely by camping out in the centre of a room, they would not modify it. Was there a chance that the carpet itself could become toxic, or that rapiers zipped upwards through the floor during the night? No, that wouldn't be fair, Renfrew decided, his fears abating somewhat. That way the apartment would be nothing more than an execution chamber, and the whole point of the Capital Punishment Reform Act of 2061 had been that it removed the awful foreknowledge of death, the feature of earlier systems to which humanitarians had most strongly objected. There had to be some prospect of getting through the week alive, and if others had done it, then so could he. It was simply a matter of intelligence, determination, and self-control, and of lasting for 7 days without a drink of water. The prison micropedia had been annoyingly imprecise about how long a man could survive on zero liquid intake. Some of the quoted authorities had avoided giving any estimate at all, and others had been content to state that death would occur after 7 to 10 days. The spread, Renfrew supposed, was due to factors such as size, weight, and general health of the subject, and the rate of water loss from the tissues, and in that respect he was doing all he could to tip the balance in his favour. He was naturally pudgy around the middle, and throughout the 4 days of his trial had loaded all his food with salt and had drunk copiously of tea, coffee, milk, and water. His tendency to retain fluids, something he had often bemoaned in the past, had enabled him to increase his body weight by approximately 10 pounds, equal to 1 gallon reservoir of life-giving liquid. That alone would probably be sufficient to ensure his survival. But Renfrew had gone further. Knowing in advance that he would be stripped of all personal possessions before being installed in the apartment, he had taken time after breakfast to spray most of his skin with an antiperspirant which fortunately was quite odourless. He suspected that his effectiveness would fade rather quickly, but by closing his pores and preventing evaporation for even part of the day, it was giving him that extra edge in the battle for life. Only 2 more measures remained to be taken. Renfrew glanced at the screen above the fireplace, checking that the jury was still deliberating. He had been in the apartment less than 5 minutes, but his defence had gone so seriously awry that he was half prepared for a verdict to be reached in record time. Fortescue, the young state-appointed attorney, had tried to make capital from the fact that the store security guard shot by Renfrew had himself been indicted only a year earlier for the manslaughter of an unarmed kid who had tried to run off with a tray of gold rings. The proposal had been that Renfrew was defending himself against a trigger-happy zealot, but the members of the jury appeared not to have been impressed. It had been obvious to Renfrew that to a man they were in favour of trigger-happy zealots and would have been pleased to employ teams of them to safeguard their own property. At that point he had begun thinking very hard indeed about ways of surviving for a week in, to give the apartment one of its more popular labels, the Hereafter Hilton. The first of the remaining precautions was to reduce evaporation of bodily moisture even further by turning the heat down. Renfrew located the thermostat and adjusted it to its lowest level. He then went into the kitchen, filled a tumbler with water and began sipping it, with the intention of increasing his fluid reserves. The notion of filling all available vessels and laying in a week's supply of water was tempting, but he put it aside as being too dangerous. Any microscopic bubble in a glass could be a poison container to be opened by remote control as soon as the jury had pressed 13 buttons and fed their votes into the computerized systems. He had almost finished the glass of water when a low but insistent chiming sound filled the apartment. He set the tumbler down, went back into the living room and saw the wording on the screen had changed. It now said, "Jury voting." "Vote early and vote often," Renfrew said aloud in jocular terms, trying to neutralise the spasms of alarm he felt on realising that the time of theorising was over, that his very existence was now being laid on the line. He took a cushion from the chair and set it in the middle of the floor, then hesitated, frowning. A cushion was just as much an artefact as a microwave oven, just as capable of being booby-trapped. He skimmed it back on the chair and squatted on the carpet, his face turned toward the screen as he waited for the final announcement. In addition to his fear, he could feel powerful undercurrents of excitement, and it came to him why the provisions of the 2061 Act had been successfully implemented in the present system. He was about to be sentenced to death, yet he had absolutely no sense of imminent doom. The inevitable reaction to the steady increase in violent crime had begun in the last quarter of the 20th century, with one state after another reintroducing the death penalty. By the middle of the 21st century, capital punishment had become almost universal, coast to coast, and the moral dilemma facing the legislators had grown in proportion. How could one condemn killing on the one hand, while going on taking human lives with the other? Variations in the actual method of execution had been tried, but the principal objections to legalised killings had remained the same. It was totally inhuman to tell a man exactly when and how he was going to die, then leave him to sweat out his time, counting off the weeks, days, hours, minutes, seconds. And if the state was inhuman, could his subjects be expected to be otherwise? It was basically a question of how to be cruel in a kindly way, and a workable answer came along in 2061. The lengthy soul-destroying delays of earlier systems had been eliminated by direct implementation of the majority vote of a 13-man jury, and the dreadful certainty of death had been replaced by the challenge of a week in the apartment. Not only were the exact time and method of execution decently shrouded in mystery, there was a ray of hope that the grim event would be avoided altogether, and that made all the difference. Analysing his own feelings, Renfrew found that he was tense, alert, stimulated, and, above all, confident that he was going to beat the system. There remained only a trace of furtive, niggling doubt. His idea seemed foolproof, but it had been rather too easy to conceive. It had, in fact, been the first scheme to blossom in his mind, and he knew perfectly well that he was anything but a genius. If he could come up with a successful plan, anybody could do it. Did that mean that nobody but the occasional moron ever paid the supreme penalty? Or was there some factor he had overlooked? There was another chiming sound, and the message on the screen was replaced by a new set of words scribed in raw crimson. Voting completed. Await verdict. On the lower part of the display, a sweep hand began remorselessly erasing a 60-second clock. Renfrew shifted to a more comfortable posture, making sure he was in the exact centre of the cleared area of carpet. I'm going to be all right, he thought. All I've got to do is stay put for 7 days. He was glancing round the room, assuring himself that nothing could go wrong, when his gaze picked out 2 vertical cracks in the skirting board of the wall opposite him. It looked as though a small flap-type door had been built into the base of the wall. He stared at the door, feeling oddly threatened as he tried to guess its purpose. It was nothing to do with ventilation. Too awkwardly positioned to be an electrical system access hatch, too small to be a cupboard. Renfrew's eyes widened as he noticed the slightest trace of wheel marks fanning out across the carpet from the flap, and understanding bloomed in his mind. Robotic cleaners. The apartment was as immaculate as only an automated cleaning system could make it, which meant that at night, when the occupants were asleep in bed, silent little machines came out of the walls and scavenged every speck of dirt. But he wasn't going to be in bed. He was going to be laid out on the floor, while the busy robots came nosing and nuzzling around him, and any of them could be capable of killing him in a dozen different ways. How fast did they travel? How many were there? Could he avoid them? Renfrew looked at the clock. It had devoured most of itself. Only 20 seconds were left until the apartment declared war on him. He half rose, his face turning toward the kitchen. Was there time to run in there, snatch up the lightweight table and get back with it? Would he be safe squatting on top of the table? What if... His hands fluttered to his mouth as he heard the final chime which signalled the jury's verdict. He glanced involuntarily in the direction of the screen, then froze, his chin sagging with incredulity as he read the 3 words electronically emblazoned across the face of the tube. Verdict: not guilty. The breath left his body in a noisy, quavering sob. He pushed a hank of hair away from his forehead, as though giving himself a better view of the glowing words might change their import. The message remained the same. Against all the odds, his defence counsel had succeeded in carrying the jury. He was a free man. Renfrew got to his feet, shaking his head in wonderment, suddenly conscious of how much he had been dreading the 7-day ordeal that had lain ahead. He took a last look at the apartment, gave a low chuckle, which expressed relief and an almost insupportable feeling of happiness, then strode to the entrance door with a buoyant tread, keyed up for his first taste of liberty in many months. The doorknob did not turn when he grasped it. Instead, it fired a cloud of poison through the skin of Renfrew's palm, a poison which was so swift-acting that he had no time to realise he had been tricked by executioners who, in their determination to be humane, were not above telling a little white lie.
The Light of Other Days by Bob Shaw. Read by Anton Rogers.
Leaving the village behind, we followed the heady sweeps of the road up into a land of slow glass. I'd never seen one of the farms before, and at first found them slightly eerie, an effect heightened by imagination and circumstance. The car's turbine was pulling smoothly and quietly in the damp air, so that we seemed to be carried over the convolutions of the road in a kind of supernatural silence. On our right, the mountains sifted down into a perfect valley of timeless pine, and everywhere stood the great frames of slow glass, drinking light. An occasional flash of afternoon sunlight on their wind bracing created an illusion of movement, but in fact, the frames were deserted. The rows of windows had been standing on the hillside for years, staring into the valley, and men only cleaned them in the middle of the night, when their human presence wouldn't matter to the thirsty glass. They were fascinating, but Selina and I didn't mention the windows. I think we hated each other so much, we both were reluctant to sully anything new by drawing it into the nexus of our emotions. The holiday, I had begun to realize, was a stupid idea in the first place. I had thought it would cure everything, but of course it didn't stop Selina being pregnant, and worse still, it didn't even stop her being angry about being pregnant. Rationalizing our dismay over her condition, we'd circulated the usual statements to the effect that we would have liked having children, but later on, at the proper time. Selina's pregnancy had cost us her well-paid job, and with it the new house we'd been negotiating, and which was far beyond the reach of my income from poetry. But the real source of our annoyance was that we were face to face with the realization that people who say they want children later always mean they want children never. Our nerves were thrumming with the knowledge that we, who'd thought ourselves so unique, had fallen into the same biological trap as every mindless, rotting creature which ever existed. The road took us along the southern slopes of Ben Chrochan, until we began to catch glimpses of the grey Atlantic far ahead. I had just cut our speed to absorb the view better when I noticed the sign spiked to a gatepost. It said, "Slow glass, quality high, prices low. J.R. Hagen." On an impulse, I stopped the car on the verge, wincing slightly as tough grasses whipped noisily at the bodywork. "Why have we stopped?" Selina's neat smoke-silver head turned in surprise. "Well, look at the sign. Let's go up and see what there is. The stuff might be reasonably priced out here." Selina's voice was pitched high with scorn as she refused. But I was too taken with my idea to listen. I had an illogical conviction that doing something extravagant and crazy would set us right again. "Come on," I said. "The exercise might do us some good. We've been driving too long anyway." She shrugged in a way that hurt me and got out of the car. We walked up a path made of irregular packed clay steps, nosed with short lengths of sapling. The path curved through trees which clothed the edge of the hill, and at its end we found a low farmhouse. Beyond the little stone building, tall frames of slow glass gazed out toward the voice-stilling sight of Crochan's ponderous descent towards the waters of Loch Lynn. Most of the panes were perfectly transparent, but a few were dark, like panels of polished ebony. As we approached the house, through a neat cobbled yard, a tall, middle-aged man in ash-coloured tweeds rose and waved to us. He had been sitting on a low rubble wall which bounded the yard, smoking a pipe and staring toward the house. At the front window of the cottage, a young woman in a tangerine dress stood with a small boy in her arms, but she turned disinterestedly and moved out of sight as we drew near. "Mr. Hagen?" I guessed. "Correct. Come to see some glass, have you? Well, you've come to the right place." Hagen spoke crisply, with traces of the pure Highland accent which sounds so much like Irish to the unaccustomed ear. He had one of those calmly dismayed faces one finds on elderly road menders and philosophers. "Yes," I said, "we're on holiday. We saw your sign." Selina, who usually has a natural fluency with strangers, said nothing. She was looking toward the now empty window with what I thought was a slightly puzzled expression. "Up from London, are you? Well, as I said, you've come to the right place. And at the right time, too. My wife and I don't see many people this early in the season." I laughed. "Does that mean that we might be able to buy a little glass without mortgaging our home?" "Look at that now," Hagen said, smiling helplessly. "I've thrown away any advantage I might have had in the transaction. Rose, that's my wife, says I'll never learn. Still, let's sit down and talk it over." He pointed at the rubble wall, then glanced doubtfully at Selina's immaculate blue skirt. "Wait till I fetch a rug from the house." Hagen limped quickly into the cottage, closing the door behind him. "Perhaps it wasn't such a marvellous idea to come up here," I whispered to Selina. "But you might at least be pleasant to the man. I think I can smell a bargain." "Some hope," she said with deliberate coarseness. "Surely even you must have noticed that ancient dress his wife was wearing. He won't give much away to strangers." "Was that his wife?" "Of course that was his wife." "Well, well," I said, surprised. "Anyway, try to be civil with him. I don't want to be embarrassed." Selina snorted, but she smiled whitely when Hagen reappeared, and I relaxed a little. Strange how a man can love a woman and yet at the same time pray for her to fall under a train. Hagen spread the tartan blanket on the wall and we sat down, feeling slightly self-conscious and having been translated from our city-orientated lives into a rural tableau. On the distant slate of the loch, beyond the watchful frames of sloe glass, a slow-moving steamer drew a white line toward the south. The boisterous mountain air seemed almost to invade our lungs, giving us more oxygen than we required. "Some of the glass farmers round here," Hagen began, "give strangers such as yourselves a sales talk about how beautiful the autumn is in this part of Argyll. Oh, it might be the spring or the winter. I don't do that. Any fool knows that the place that doesn't look right in summer never looks right. What do you say?" I nodded compliantly. "I want you just to take a good look out toward Mull, Mr. Garland. Garland. That's what you're buying if you buy my glass. And it never looks better than it does at this minute. The glass is in perfect phase, none of it less than 10 years thick, and a 4-foot window will cost you £200. "200?" Selina said, shocked. "That's as much as they charge at the Sindar shop in Bond Street." Hagen smiled patiently, then looked closely at me to see if I knew enough about glass to appreciate what he'd been saying. His price had been much higher than I'd hoped, but 10 years thick. The cheap glass one found in places like Vistaplex or Panorama stores usually consisted of 1/4 of an inch of ordinary glass, faced with a veneer of sloe glass, perhaps only 10 or 12 months thick. "You don't understand, darling," I said, already determined to buy. "This glass will last 10 years, and it's in phase. Doesn't that only mean it keeps time?" Hagen smiled at her again, realizing he had no further necessity to bother with me. "Only, you say? Oh, pardon me, Mrs. Garland, but you don't seem to appreciate the miracle, the genuine, honest-to-goodness miracle of engineering precision needed to produce a piece of glass in phase. When I say the glass is 10 years thick, it means it takes light 10 years to pass through it. In effect, each one of those panes is 10 light years thick, more than twice the distance to the nearest star. So a variation in actual thickness of only 1/1,000,000th of an inch would—" He stopped talking for a moment and sat quietly looking towards the house. I turned my head from the view of the loch and saw the young woman standing at the window again. Hagen's eyes were filled with a kind of greedy reverence, which made me feel uncomfortable, and at the same time convinced me Selina had been wrong. In my experience, husbands never looked at wives that way. At least, not at their own. The woman remained in view for a few seconds, dress glowing warmly, then moved back into the room. Suddenly I received a distinct, though inexplicable, impression she was blind. My feeling was that Selina and I were perhaps blundering through an emotional interplay as violent as our own. "I'm sorry," Hagan continued. "I thought Rose was going to call me for something. Now, where was I, Mrs. Garland? 10 light years compressed into a quarter of an inch means—" I ceased to listen, partly because I was already sold, partly because I'd heard the story of slow glass many times before and had never yet understood the principles involved. An acquaintance with scientific training had once tried to be helpful by telling me to visualize a pane of slow glass as a hologram, which didn't need coherent light from a laser for the reconstitution of its visual information, and in which every photon of ordinary light passed through a spiral tunnel coiled outside the radius of capture of each atom in the glass. This gem of, to me, incomprehensibility not only told me nothing, it convinced me once again that a mind as non-technical as mine should concern itself less with causes than effects. The most important effect in the eyes of the average individual was that light took a long time to pass through a sheet of slow glass. A new piece was always jet black, because nothing had yet come through. But one could stand the glass beside, say, a woodland lake, until the scene emerged, perhaps a year later. If the glass was then removed and installed in a dismal city flat, the flat would, for that year, appear to overlook the woodland lake. During the year, it wouldn't be merely a very realistic but still picture. The water would ripple in sunlight, silent animals would come to drink, birds would cross the sky, night would follow day, season would follow season, until one day, a year later, the beauty held in the subatomic pipelines would be exhausted, and the familiar grey cityscape would reappear. Apart from its stupendous novelty value, the commercial success of slow glass was founded on the fact that having a scene dough was the exact emotional equivalent of owning land. The meanest cave dweller could look out on misty parks, and who was to say they weren't his? A man who really owns tailored gardens and estates doesn't spend his time proving his ownership by crawling on his ground, feeling, smelling, tasting it. All he receives from the land are light patterns, and with scene doughs, these patterns could be taken into coal mines, submarines, prison cells. On several occasions, I've tried to write short pieces about the enchanted crystal, but to me the theme is so ineffably poetic as to be, paradoxically, beyond the reach of poetry. Mine, at any rate. Besides, the best songs and verse had already been written, with prescient inspiration, by men who had died long before slow glass was discovered. I had no hope of equalling, for example, Moore, with his "Oft in the stilly night, ere slumber's chains has bound me, fond memory brings the light of other days around me." It took only a few years for slow glass to develop from a scientific curiosity to a sizable industry. And much to the astonishment of us poets, those of us who remain convinced that beauty lives though lilies die, the trappings of that industry were no different from those of any other. There were good scene doughs, which cost a lot of money, and there were inferior scene doughs, which cost rather less. The thickness, measured in years, was an important factor in the cost. But there was also the question of actual thickness, or phase. Even with the most sophisticated engineering techniques available, thickness control was something of a hit-and-miss affair. A coarse discrepancy could mean that a pane, intended to be 5 years thick, might be 5.5, so that light which entered in summer emerged in winter. A fine discrepancy could mean that noon sunshine emerged at midnight. These incompatibilities had their peculiar charm. Many night workers, for example, liked having their own private time zones. But in general, it cost more to buy scene doughs which kept closely in step with real time. Selina still looked unconvinced when Hagan had finished speaking. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, and I knew he'd been using the wrong approach. Quite suddenly, the pewter helmet of her hair was disturbed by a cool gust of wind, and huge, clean, tumbling drops of rain began to spring round us from an almost cloudless sky. "I'll give you a cheque now," I said abruptly, and saw Selina's green eyes triangulate angrily on my face. "You can arrange delivery." "Oh, aye, delivery's no problem," Hagan said, getting to his feet. But wouldn't you rather take a glass with you?" "Well, yes, if you don't mind." I was shamed by his readiness to trust my scrip. "I'll unclip a pin for you. Wait here, it won't take long to slip it into a carrying frame." Hagan limped down the slope towards the Seriot windows, through some of which the view towards Lynn was sunny, while others were cloudy and a few pure black. Selina drew the collar of her blouse close at the throat. "The least he could have done was invite us inside. Can't be so many fools passing through that he can afford to neglect them." I tried to ignore the insult and concentrated on writing the cheque. One of the outside drops broke across my knuckles, splattering the pink paper. "All right," I said. "Let's move in under the eaves till he gets back." You bitch, I thought, as I felt the whole thing go completely wrong. I just had to be a fool to marry you. A prize fool. A fool's fool. And now that you've trapped part of me inside you, I'll never, ever, never, ever, ever get away. Feeling my stomach clench itself painfully, I ran behind Selina to the side of the cottage. Beyond the window, the neat living room with its coal fire was empty, but child's toys were scattered on the floor. Alphabet blocks and a wheelbarrow the exact colour of freshly pared carrots. As I stared in, the boy came running from the other room and began kicking the blocks. He didn't notice me. A few moments later, the young woman entered the room and, lifting him, laughed easily and wholeheartedly as she swung the boy under her arm. She came to the window as she'd done earlier. I smiled self-consciously, but neither she nor the child responded. My forehead pricked icily. Could they both be blind? I sidled away. Selina gave a little scream and I spun towards her. "The rug," she said, "it's getting soaked." She ran across the yard in the rain, snatched the reddish square from the dappling wall and ran back toward the cottage door. Something heaved convulsively in my subconscious. "Selina!" I shouted. "Don't open it!" But it was too late. She'd pushed open the latched wooden door and was standing, hand over mouth, looking into the cottage. I moved close to her and took the rug from her unresisting fingers. As I was closing the door, I let my eyes traverse the cottage's interior. The neat living room in which I'd just seen the woman and the child was, in reality, a sickening clutter of shabby furniture, old newspapers, cast-off clothing, and smeared dishes. It was damp, stinking, and utterly deserted. The only object I recognized from my view through the window was the little wheelbarrow, paintless and broken. I latched the door firmly and ordered myself to forget what I'd seen. Some men who live alone are good housekeepers. Others just don't know how. Selina's face was white. I don't understand. I don't understand it. "Slow glass works both ways," I said gently. "Light passes out of a house as well as in." "You mean?" "I don't know. It isn't your business. Now, steady up. Hagan's coming back with our glass." The churning in my stomach was beginning to subside. Hagan came into the yard carrying an oblong plastic-covered frame. I held the cheque out to him, but he was staring at Selina's face. He seemed to know immediately that our uncomprehending fingers had rummaged through his soul. Selina avoided his gaze. She was old and ill-looking, and her eyes stared determinedly toward the near horizon. "I'll take the rug from you, Mrs. Garland," Hagan finally said. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself over it." "No trouble. Here's the cheque." "Thank you." He was still looking at Selina with a strange kind of supplication. "It's been a pleasure to do business with you." "The pleasure was mine," I said in equal, senseless formality. I picked up the heavy frame and guided Selina toward the path which led to the road. Just as we reached the head of the now slippery steps, Hagen spoke again. "Mr. Garland?" I turned unwillingly. "It wasn't my fault," he said steadily. "A hit-and-run driver got them both, down on the Oban Road 6 years ago. My boy was only 7 when it happened. I'm entitled to keep something." I nodded wordlessly and moved down the path, holding my wife close to me, treasuring the feel of her arms locked around me. At the bend, I looked back through the rain and saw Hagen sitting with squared shoulders on the wall where we'd first seen him. He was looking at the house, but I was unable to tell if there was anyone at the window.
A Glitch in Time by Paul Finch. Read by John Pertwee.
The men of science shook their heads sadly as they gazed through the two-way mirror into the debrief room next door. Major Peterson, the astronaut, was sitting at one side of a white table, clad only in a blue NASA running suit. He tapped his fingers on the smooth surface with irritation. "Has anyone any thoughts how this might have happened?" he eventually asked. Peterson, too, sitting opposite him, shrugged. And standing alone in the corner, shuffling his sneakered feet, Peterson III was equally lost for ideas. "I mean, surely," Peterson said, "someone must know something." Again, the other two knew nothing. Peterson went on. "Look, I'm only the third man to go through the matter transmission field, right? So that means 2 other guys went before me. What the goddamn hell is going on here? Why doesn't anybody know?" "Yeah, well, some glitch in the system," said Peterson II after a moment. "Oh, you don't say," snapped Peterson with venom. "Well, how the hell should we know?" asked Peterson III. "We only just got born." Peterson snorted with contempt. "Geez, I can't believe you two dummies are versions of me." "Hey, you think we wanted this?" retorted Peterson II. "Yeah, it would have been nice to be, asked," put in Peterson III. "Look, you can be damn sure it wasn't my idea," said Peterson. "Jesus Christ, a 50-yard jump across a lab, they said. No risk at all. The system's working A1. Soon we'll be crossing continents. Only trouble is, when I land again, I've got you 2 jerks in tow. What if I had jumped a continent? I mean, how many new brothers would I have picked up then?" "Well, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with distance," put in Peterson III. Peterson II agreed. "Yeah, there's no distance in the jump field. At least, that's what they told us when we were all together." Peterson dropped his head into his hands. Have I really been such a smart-ass all my life? Dear God. Is this what others have had to put up with from me? Now Peterson III got angry. "You know, pal, there might be some way we can fix that." "Yeah," said Peterson II. "Seems to me there are 2 Petersons too many in this room." Peterson III looked sharply round at him. "Oh, yeah? So which one of us stays?" "Well, how do I know? But it stands to reason," said Peterson II. "Top secret or not, they can't let this go. There can't be 3 of us walking around out there." "You 2 sprouts don't seriously think they're ever going to consider letting you outside this building, do you?" laughed Peterson, amazed. "Ah, get a life, asshole," said Peterson III. "We're the discovery of the century. They'll not get rid of us for your sake. And they'll not let you go blabbing about it either." "Yeah," said Peterson II. Your life as you knew it is over. You won't ever be going home again, not even for a roll with Carol or a nice cool beer from the fridge. Just forget all that. So, who's laughing now? You sons of bitches! Shouted Peterson, leaping to his feet. And so it went on. On the other side of the glass, the men of science watched sadly as Peterson stormed around the otherwise empty room, furiously arguing with himself. Insane, said Professor Hendricks after a moment. Hopelessly insane. His mind's gone completely. He took off his spectacles and rubbed them. I just can't believe it. Were our 2 trips one-offs then? Beside him, Professor Hebeling could only shake his head. Well, I'm looking as hard as I can, John, but I'm sure I can't see anybody else in the room with him. Nor me, said Hendricks 2. Nor me, said Hebeling 3. Hendricks 3 simply shrugged. Hebeling 2 had gone to take a leak.
Dream Fighter by Bob Shaw. Read by Martin Kemp.
Rowan and his wife had to carry their own cases up 3 flights of stairs and along a sad brown corridor. Some of the lighting fixtures were broken, and the others served only to create dirty orange smudges on the walls. Jane stopped outside the room the desk clerk had assigned them and looked about her with a mixture of disdain and weariness. Some hotel, she said. Why do you allow Sammy to book us into places like this? It's only for one night, Rowan told her. It's always only for one night. I can't go on like this much longer, Victor. We'll be taking a break soon. I don't see how. The money you get for one fight these days barely sees us through to the next. It's better than no money, which is what I'd have if I... The weight of the cases in Rowan's hands suddenly became unbearable. Do you mind if we continue the conversation inside? If we're paying for the room, we might as well make use of it. Jane nodded, turned the key in the lock and pushed the door open. Just beyond it, in the shabby dimness of the room, stood a grinning, scaly horror, part man, part dragon, which raised a claw hand in menace. Jane drew breath sharply, but stood her ground. "Victor," she said. "Victor!" "No, I'm sorry," Rowan mumbled. He closed his mind painfully, and the creature vanished into nothingness. "You're losing control." Jane strode forward, through the spot where the apparition had just been, and slung her case onto the bed. "Isn't that a sign it's time to quit?" "How in hell can I quit?" Rowan kicked the door shut behind him, dropped the cases, and lay down on the other bed. The soft, walnut-sized bump on the top of his head was throbbing, aching, flooding him with disquiet. He cupped his hand over it, feeling the unnatural warmth through his cropped hair, and tried to relax. "Victor, you're in no condition to fight." Jane spoke softly as she knelt beside him. Grateful for the warmth in her voice, Rowan turned to his wife. The years had honed the original prettiness of her face into taut, economical planes which Rowan saw as beauty. "I'll be all right," he said. "If I beat Grumman tonight, the purse will be enough to let us..." He stopped as Jane began to shake her head. "Victor, you've lost 12 fights in a row, against third-raters, and Grumman's supposed to be good. Perhaps he's not all that good. He's too good for you." There was no malice or reproach in Jane's words. 5 years ago it would have been different, but now... I mean, I can't understand how Sammy even got you the fixture. "You know who to put your money on then?" Rowan was referring to his wife's small ritual bet, which lately had become a monetary sacrifice. "Never," she said. "Now you'd better get some rest." Rowan closed his eyes and courted sleep, but his nerves were charged with awareness of the contest which was only a few hours away. There was an agitation, a restless traffic along his neural pathways, and his exo-brain, that seat of supernormal power, seemed to crouch on top of his skull like a tiny animal with a disparate life of its own, scheming and dreaming. The taxi in which Sammy Kling rode downtown had been old even before they had ripped out its gasoline engine and put in a battery-powered unit. He perched on a narrow rear seat, staring out at the shabby street with eyes which had lost some of their usual glitter. How come, he asked himself, that so many good cities got clobbered in the dust-up, while dumps like this survived? He was a flinty little man, normally immune to his surroundings, but he was in a mood of vulnerability brought on by the telephone call he had received some minutes earlier. It had lasted about 20 seconds, consisting of nothing more than a terse instruction from Tux Raphael, Grumman's manager, to meet him at his hotel. Raphael had hung up without waiting for Kling's assent. The fact that he could be treated in such a manner, Kling realised, was an indication of how far he had sunk in the world. There was a time when he had owned pieces of 4 good fighters, but 1 had died and 2 had burned up. The one who remained, Vic Rowan, was fading fast, and should have been put out to pasture years earlier. When the taxi dropped him at the Sheraton, he paid without any argument the exorbitant sum demanded by the driver and went inside. Raphael's suite was only on the 4th floor, but Kling, too dispirited to walk, paid the elevator surcharge and rode up. 2 hard-looking men showed him into the well-lit silvery room where Raphael was lounging in a deep chair and making a telephone call. Raphael had grown fatter and shinier in the years since Kling had last seen him, but Kling's attention was absorbed by the younger man who was standing at the window. Built more like an old-style boxer than a dream fighter, Ferdy Grumman had pale grey eyes fringed with white lashes. In contrast to the powerful musculature of his body, his mouth was small and womanly, pursed in permanent distaste. His scalp was shaved to reveal the irregular blister of the exo-brain centred on top of his skull. Kling stared at him for a moment. Then, as their eyes met, he felt an icy sensation of dread, a fierce projection of hatred, and he knew at once that Grumman was a borderline psycho, a man whose main reason for fighting was that monsters were devouring his soul. He quickly averted his gaze and saw Grumman's pink lips twitch in satisfaction. Poor Rowan, Kling thought. Poor, gentle, faded-out Rowan hasn't a chance. Tonight could finish him. The thought inspired in Kling a rare flash of guilt about his profession. Several different kinds of mutants had appeared in the human race in the years that following the dust-up, all of them characterised by the extrusion of extracortical tissue through the fontanelle. There were the straightforward telepaths, many of whom had been killed before the UN had extended special protection, and there were the seers, and those with limited powers of telekinesis. Their abilities had proved useful to society in one way or another, and they had found profitable roles, but there had also been a sprinkling of unclassifiables, including those individuals whose gift it was to make others see things which did not exist. They functioned partially by instinctive control of radiation fields around them. The images they created could be photographed, but there was also an element of telepathy, because the visions were much more realistic and more detailed to the naked eye than to the camera. In a tired and shabby world, the opportunity for a new kind of spectator sport had been seized at once, and the trade of the dream fighter had come into existence. There were countries where the sport was illegal because of the psychological wear and tear on the combatants, and, in the dreadful presence of Grumman, Kling understood the reasoning.
Hello, Sammy.
Raphael said, setting the telephone down.
How you been?
Okay, Tux. I'm getting along okay. Raphael smiled disbelievingly.
Have you met my boy, Ferdy?
No. Hello. Kling nodded towards Grumman and looked away again, unwilling to face the eyes. Grumman did not acknowledge the greeting in any way. Raphael's smile broadened.
Right, Sammy. We get down to business. My Ferdy is going to be the next area champion, and I'm making him a contender before the end of the year.
That's fast, Kling commented, knowing it was expected of him.
You bet it's fast. That's why he's got to get 10 straight wins in the next 5 weeks. That's my program for him, and I'm not taking no chances with it. No chances at all.
Kling nodded. Why did you want to see me?
It's like this. Ferdy will destroy Vic Rowan tonight. But because this is a big operation with a lot of heavy money involved, I'm handing you $2K for insurance, if you know what I mean.
Kling fought to control the pounding in his chest. You want Vic to throw the fight?
He won't be throwing it,
Raphael explained, with a mock patience.
I'm generous. I'm giving you and Rowan $1,000 each just to accept defeat gracefully.
It's a waste of money,
Grumman said in a sullen monotone.
I'm gonna turn Rowan's brain into mush and let it run out of his eyes.
Raphael waved him to silence.
What do you say, Sammy?
Kling's brain was analysing the situation with cryogenic efficiency. Rowan was going to lose anyway. The last shreds of his reputation was going, and it was becoming difficult to match him. He was so certain to lose that there was no need even to tell him about the fix. And with 2,000 monets in his pocket, he, Sammy Kling, could quit the fight game and go into something which offered better returns and more security. The decision was easy to make. You've got yourself a deal, Tux, he said. The figure was 2K.
It's all there.
Raphael took a long envelope from an inner pocket of his jacket and handed it to Kling. Thanks, Tux. Kling turned to leave and was almost at the door when Raphael called him.
Sammy, Vic Rowan used to be good, didn't he?
People say that.
Just remember, you and Rowan have taken my money. I bought you, right? And if there's any funny business tonight, I'll put you both through the meat grinder. Got it?
Kling nodded silently and hurried out of the room. Rowan brushed his hair, trying not to touch the now burning lump, and turned to his wife. Are you coming to the fight? To help carry you out afterwards. Jane exhaled a cloud of cigarette smoke. No thanks. I've only been carried out once. Rowan gave up the struggle to find the right words. He closed the door and went down 3 flights of stairs to where Sammy Kling was waiting with a taxi. The little man looked perfectly normal, but a vague signal from his exo-brain suggested to Rowan that Kling had things on his mind. All right, Sammy, he said as he got into the waiting vehicle. I'm all right, Kling replied gloomily. A bit worried about you, though. Why? I don't like some of the things I hear about Grumman. Listen, Vic, when you feel him getting the edge on you, don't wreck yourself trying to stop him. Just bow out, huh? Rowan felt a stab of annoyance. Why is it everybody so worked up about Ferdy Grumman? I just don't think you should risk getting your brain scrambled, that's all, Kling muttered. It's up to you, of course. I know it is. Rowan sat without speaking for the rest of the short journey to the stadium. He knew he was going to lose again, that he no longer had the vital drive to win, but some remnant of his former self resented being written off so casually. The perverse notion crossed his mind that it might be worth beating Grumman for nothing more than the pleasure of seeing Jane's face when she heard the news. At the amber-lit stadium, he got the check-in formalities over as quickly as possible, and was glad to reach the solitude of the preparation room. It was an important part of the system that dream fighters did not meet prior to a bout, especially in the final minutes, when antagonism was high and control of their powers most likely to slip. He lay on the simple bed and half heard, half felt the occasional eruptions of the cheering from the crowd in the arena above. Grumman and he were fourth on the bill, a good position, and the audience would be receptive when they went on. Lying perfectly still, scarcely breathing, Rowan made himself ready for the struggle ahead. When the signal came, a double chime from the loudspeaker on the wall, He rose without haste and went along the corridor to a ramp which ascended to the arena. A strongly built man he recognised as Grumman emerged from another corridor and reached the foot of the ramp at the same time. Rowan was instantly aware of his opponent's chilling psychic aura, but he went through it, like a swimmer breasting an icy tide, and held out his hand. "I've heard a lot about you," he said. Grumman looked down at the outstretched hand and conjured a piece of brown, smoking filth into it. The image was too close to Rowan's sphere of influence to last for more than a fraction of a second before he blanked it out of existence. But the accompanying mental shockwave had the force of a physical blow. Face unchanged, pale eyes staring. Grumman walked on up the ramp. Rowan followed him, barely aware of the reverberating announcements which boomed across the amphitheatre, cursing himself for having given Grumman the opportunity to take the psychological advantage. At the head of the ramp, one on each side, were two low circular bases. Grumman went to the one on the left. Rowan turned right and was still a couple of paces from his base when there was an abrupt silence, followed by the sound of a woman screaming. He spun and found himself facing a 30-foot-high demon. A red light began flashing in the judge's kiosk to indicate that Grumman had made a foul play by leading off before the signal. Rowan's senses were swamped by the reality of the beast towering over him. He had seen many monsters during his career, beings designed to inspire fear and thus weakness. But this one was in a class of its own. Its face was a compound of things human and things animal, and of things the earth had never seen. Its body was grotesquely deformed, yet true to alien symmetries. Black, powerful, matted with hair in some places, glistening naked in others. And above all, the demon was obscene, massively sexual, with an overpowering realization of detail which had intended effect of cowing the beholder's mind. Rowan was closest to the apparition, and he took the full projected force of it. He moved backwards, instinctively, and felt his way onto his base, filled with an intense reluctance to go on with the fight. It would mean entering a strange intimacy with the demon's creator, and that was something which should not be asked of him. He considered quitting in the first moment, by stepping down from the base. Then came the understanding that he was reacting exactly as his opponent intended, which was something a dream fighter should never do. That was what such contests were basically all about. The forces of nightmare. The conquering of minds by the use of no weapon but fear itself. Habits developed over many years caused him to probe at the towering demon with intangible senses, and he found the image hard. That meant Grumman was playing a one-shot, concentrating all his powers into a single protagonist with which he intended to win the contest. The discovery surprised Rowan, because it hinted at a lack of flexibility which was dangerous for any fighter trying to make it in the big time. He gathered his strength, opened the shutters of his mind, and put up a scaly, slope-shouldered dinosaur, equal in height to the demon, but many times greater in apparent mass. There was a gasp of appreciation from the encircling terraces. Rowan caused the dinosaur to lunge forward, but the black demon, moving with incredible speed, swung a razored hand at its throat and connected. The movement was carried out so naturally, with such coordinated and perfect simulation of reality, that Rowan was momentarily convinced, and in being convinced, yielded control of his own image. There was a huge fountain of dark blood, and the dinosaur fell sideways, its head almost torn off. Rowan automatically dissolved the writhing creature into nothingness, while he fought to regain control of his own terror. Caught unawares, he had still been involved with the dinosaur when it was killed, and now part of his subconscious knew what it was like to be ripped asunder by organic knives. Unbidden, in spite of all his efforts to prevent it, a lethal fear began to seep through him. The demon shook knotted arms above its head in silent triumph, and the seemingly tiny Grumman performed the same gestures, like a puppet gyrating at the feet of its master. Rowan forced himself to rally. His exo-brain was on fire, pulsing with agony, but he took command of it. and perhaps reacting against the demon's associations with evil, put up a giant knight in full medieval armour. The warrior was equipped with a two-handed sword which he swung against the demon in a glittering sweep. But the blow never landed. The demon was too fast, too ferocious. Again Rowan was convinced, and again he yielded control. The bright armour was slashed open like foil, the blood spurted, and another part of Rowan died. After that he tried a two-headed python, which was torn apart even as it materialised around the demon's neck, and a bat-winged creature which Grumman's demon dismembered with contemptuous ease. Each time, Rowan was unable to disengage quickly enough, and the resulting neural punishment brought him to his knees. His exobrain was a blob of white-hot metal searing through his skull. He clasped the top of his head with both hands and rocked backwards and forwards, peering through slitted eyes. The crowd, sensing that the crisis point had been reached, ceased to make any sound. "It's time to step down," Rowan told himself. "You don't have to die again. Just step down off the base and it will all be over, and you can have a rest." His involuntary swaying movements grew more violent as his body, unconcerned with matters of pride or prestige, fought against the dictates of his intellect.
Go ahead, old man. Fall over.
Grumman's gloating whisper reached him across the stellar distances.
This is the time to do it. Just fall over.
Rowan stared at him uncomprehendingly. Everybody expected him to do the same thing. Jane, Sammy, Grumman, they all wanted him to fall over. In a way, it seemed a good idea, not to fight any longer, and yet... Rowan brought his eyes to a focus on the opposite base and made an astonishing discovery. Grumman was concentrating his attention on Rowan, indulging in personal enmity, instead of monitoring the image which loomed above him. Rowan glanced upwards and saw that the edges of the huge demon had softened slightly, that some of the oppressive detail had been allowed to blur. He waited for a full second while, from the depths of his memory, he summoned up an old friend, one who had settled many issues for him in the past. Valerius was a professional soldier, a scarred and weather-beaten veteran who had served with 3 different legions in Syria, Gaul and Britain. He had withstood rain, snow and desert heat with equal stoicism, and he had slain the varied enemies of Rome with impartial efficiency, regardless of whether they wore silks or skins, regardless of which gods those enemies believed to be giving them protection. He was a stolid, unimaginative man, as plain, functional and uncompromising as the short sword he carried, and in all the years of service he had never encountered a creature which could survive having an iron blade driven through its guts. And as Valerius saw things, this meant that no such creature existed. Rowan, knowing by heart every detail, every rivet and thong of the legionaries' equipment and armour, snapped him into existence in microseconds. He was much smaller than the demon, a sign that Rowan's strength was nearly spent, but the sword was sharp, and he struck with economical swiftness. The blade went deep into the demon's protruding belly, and pus-like fluid spouted. Rowan heard Grumman grunt with pain and surprise, and he guessed at once that the younger man had never experienced neuroshock before. This is what it's like, he thought savagely, directing onto the demon a flurry of hacking blows which transmitted their fury to its creator, convulsing him with sympathetic shock. Grumman turned his eyes upwards, guiding the black demon as it made a snapping rush, but Valerius, his body protected by a long Roman shield, struck at the face with almost clinical exactitude. Grumman whimpered and fell backward from his base. His demon vanished as he struck the floor. The fight had ended. In spite of his exhaustion, Rowan kept Valerius in existence long enough for him to acknowledge the cheers of the crowd with upraised sword, and then gradually dissolved him out. They shouldn't have written us off, he told the fading warrior. They should never write a man off. It was late, and the stadium had emptied before Rowan broke free of the local sports reporters. He had spent some time trying to find Sammy Kling, and finally had to go to the promoter's office alone to collect the winner's purse, a cheque for 500 monets. Puzzled by Sammy's absence, Rowan waited on the front steps of the building for a few minutes, nodding as the box office staff bade him good night and the stadium was sectionally plunged into blackness. He debated calling a taxi, then decided that walking back to the hotel would ease the dull pounding in his head. The aftertaste of victory was less pleasant than it had seemed in his memory. He lit a cigarette and walked north on a shadowed street. The car drew in beside him with a feline swiftness, its sleek haunches speckled with rain, and 4 men got out of it. They closed on Rowan without speaking. Sensing their purpose, he ducked his head and tried to run, but 2 of them hit him at the same time, with what felt like mailed fists, and he went down. Within seconds, he had been dragged into an alley, and there followed a nightmarish period during which he was systematically kicked from neck to groin. Eventually, the blood-red explosions of pain seemed to diminish, and he realised, with gratitude, that he was escaping into unconsciousness.
That's enough,
A voice said from somewhere above him.
He's gotta know what's happening.
The assault on his body ceased, and the dim figures redeployed. In the faint light from the street, one of them appeared to be holding an ordinary garden spade. Rowan became aware of an even greater threat than that of simply being bludgeoned, and he tried to fight against it.
Hold his head steady.
The dark figure moved over him, foreshortening like Grumman's demon, and his head was clamped in place on the wet concrete. "No!" Rowan pleaded. "No!"
Yeah, Ron,
the voice told him.
and don't say you weren't warned.
The spade drove downwards across his skull, shearing through skin and extraneous brain tissue alike, and in the ultimate pang of agony, Rowan was born into the world of normal men. Perhaps 2 hours elapsed before he resumed walking back to the hotel. The street seemed unusually quiet, but he was unable to decide if the impression was a genuine one or something subjective, stemming from the newly found silence within his head. Occasional cars ghosted by without stopping, their occupants undisturbed by the sight of a drunk staggering homewards with a bloodied handkerchief pressed to his scalp. The hotel lobby was deserted, enabling him to climb the 3 flights of stairs without being seen. When he fumbled open the door, there was a darkness beyond, but the tiny beacon of a cigarette near the window signalled that Jane was awake and waiting for him. "Where have you been, Victor?" she said quietly. "What happened to you?" The concern in his wife's voice reminded Rowan that she had her own kind of dreams, better dreams than those which had just ceased to dominate his own life. "What do you want first?" he said, forcing his body to remain upright for the necessary moment. "The bad news or the good news?"
Silent Partners by Bob Shaw. Read by Martin Jarvis.
At first he could see nothing about her except that she was dressed in furs, then that her hair was blonde and, in spite of the night wind, as smooth as glass. When the woman drew nearer, he made out the glitter of jewellery at her ears and throat, and of gold at her wrists. Then he could see her face, which was beautiful. He didn't know the woman, and yet her face was almost familiar, like that of someone he might have dreamt of a long time ago. Purvey crouched in the utter darkness of the bushes and waited for her to come within reach. From where he'd stationed himself, he could see both lamplit entrances to the tiny park and something of the quiet suburban streets beyond. It was strange, then, that he'd not noticed the woman come through the gates, but perhaps he'd overdone it with the whiskey while he was waiting. It was years now since he'd had to go out and actually rob somebody, and his nerves had needed damping down with alcohol. The outlook in the confidence business was pretty bleak when a practitioner of 20 years' standing had to resort to outright robbery. Taking a deep breath, he slid the pistol from his pocket and quickly stepped out onto the path. "Don't make a sound," he warned the woman. "Just hand over your purse and that stuff you're wearing." He stared into her face, trying to gauge whether she was the type to do as she was told, or the unpredictable, troublesome variety of customer. In the dim light coming from the street, Purvey saw that something had gone terribly wrong with the beautiful face. His hand flew nervously to his mouth, and he took a step backwards, raising the pistol protectively. The woman sagged bonelessly, crumpled, withered away in a second, leaving nothing but a small dark object writhing on the ground at Purvey's feet. With a moan of sheer despair, he turned to run. He was much too late. Purvey very rarely dreamed, but when he was 12 years old, he'd once had a nightmare in which he'd committed suicide by lying in a coffin with earth and roses in it. The thorns had pierced his flesh and drawn the blood from him, making the roses flourish and bloom, until he'd been sucked dry and was lying dead beneath a beautiful living shroud of blossoms. Then, as one can do in dreams, he'd realized he didn't want to commit suicide, after all. He had that same feeling now. Huge fleshy leaves and dozens of dark green tendrils lay across his chest and face, stirring slightly in the wind and sending exploratory tricklets of cold water into his clothing. Summoning all his strength, he pushed the tangled mass aside, sat up, and realized at once that he was aboard a spaceship. He'd been back and forth to the Lagrangian colonies in moon orbit enough times to enable him to recognize the sensation, even though his surroundings looked less like the interior of a spaceship than almost anything else he'd seen. The low, almost circular room was brilliantly lit from the ceiling in some places and dark in others, giving an impression of shadowy vastness quite out of keeping with its true size. The walls were dark brown and streaming with moisture. Large fans positioned at intervals around the walls were making random-seeming movements on their bearings and creating a cold, irregular wind. The floor was covered with a thin coating of mud, from which jutted a disorderly clutter of instrument pedestals, machine housings, cables, and low partitions. There appeared to be nobody in the room but himself. Purvey scrambled to his feet, almost fell with dizziness, and made his way over to one of the instrument stands, which was emitting a red glow and a peculiar high-pitched whistle which kept changing in tone. On the pedestal was a small screen depicting a few brilliant stars against a background of crimson space. The markings on the dials were little blobs of many different colors. He made a circuit of the room, assuring himself that it was empty. Then he began shouting for someone to come and let him out. Nobody came. Purvey was feeling dizzier by the minute, as though the air contained some insidious intoxicant. He crossed the room, falling once on the slippery mud, and stood staring down at the little view screen, wondering how he got into the nightmarish predicament. All at once, his memory of recent events iced into sharp focus in his mind. The woman in the park. How could he have forgotten that hideously dissolving face, or the way she'd turned into the indescribable thing on the ground? He ran his fingers over the smooth glass of the view screen, feeling slightly relieved at the realization that it, was not in the immediate vicinity. Something behind him made a wet, slithering sound. Purvey spun round, feeling his mouth drag itself out of shape with fear. The dark green stuff which had been spilling across his face and chest when he awoke had come crawling after him, leaving a broad trail behind it in the mud. In the center of the mass of leaves and tendrils, Purvey glimpsed a complicated knobbly core about 1/2 meter in diameter. Some of the tendrils ended in shiny black beads, which looked as though they might serve the function of eyes. Purvey backed away from the thing and felt in his pocket for the pistol. It wasn't there. When a wall ended his retreat, he stood staring at the moving growth as it labored towards him, propelled by some dimly seen agitation under its core. It stopped advancing when it was about 1 human pace away from him, and remained motionless for what seemed to Purvey a long, long time. Then he noticed that across one huge leaf on the top of the mass, faint letters bleached out in a lighter green had appeared. The thing was trying to communicate with him. "You shall have gold," the letters spelled out. The black-beaded tendrils waved gently in the air, and the odour of the thing reached up to Purvey, the smell of dusty ivy growing on a decaying wall. Purvey, responding to one of his favourite words, was immediately less apprehensive. What for? He sank down onto his heels and tried to peer into the depths of the apparently intelligent vegetation. Why will I have gold? Another long pause ensued. Then the green writing faded and was replaced by explosion wrecked part of the ship. Then including repair shop. Then Lur has made rough repairs. Then you are highly mobile. Then you will stand by during trip. Then Lur will pay with gold. I don't know how to repair spaceships, Purvey pointed out, playing for time in which to think. The work will be simple. You are mobile. I will direct you. The sentences took a long time to come across by means of the thing's, Lur's, controlled etiolation effect. Purvey groped around in his pocket and found a flattened pack of cigarettes and a permatch. When he struck the match, it burned with a large, brilliant flame, and he guessed that the air in the ship was loaded with oxygen. That might explain why he felt so dizzy, almost drunk. He blew out the match with some difficulty, put it away, and drew deeply on the cigarette, relishing it. Will you take me back to Earth afterwards? Yes. Purvey considered asking Lur to promise, but decided against it, as he had no way of knowing how much the vegetable's word was worth. It might be no more trustworthy than some of his friends. I'd like to know how you got me here, he said. It seemed a bit, sort of unethical. Not the sort of behaviour one would expect from a salad citizen, he thought reprovingly. But there was no reply to his question. He noticed that the black beads had dulled as though Lur had gone to sleep. Purvey snorted disgustedly. He crouched against the wall, coat collar turned up, and finished his cigarette. The only sound in the room was the restless whispering of the fans on the wall above. Sometime later, after a period of uneasy sleep, Purvey woke up with a new problem. The vine-like growths that formed the extensions of Lur's body were draped wetly across him, as they had been on his first awakening. He ended the distasteful intimacy by pushing the dark green mass away, trying to understand why it came near him at all. Listen, he said suspiciously. How long will the trip last? A broad leaf unfurled and the laboured writing appeared. 15 of your days. What about food? Purvey demanded. I'll need food. You shall share the Artor's food. Artor? What's that? Artor is a helper. She brought you here. I don't want her food, Purvey said, suddenly afraid. Artor will not mind. Lur stirred slowly and moved away, leaving a trail through which could be seen the whitish metal of the floor beneath. There were small perforations in it, and as Purvey watched, more mud welled up through them until the metal was covered. Purvey followed Lur, wondering if its last remark had been some kind of sarcasm. Reaching a little door low down on a bulkhead, Lur extended a tendril, touched a white circle, and the door opened, revealing a plain, cupboard-like interior. At the touch of another circle, a hatch opened in the rear surface, and a block of pink, spongy material slid out. Purvey picked it up warily, but he'd been hungry long before his current misfortunes had begun, and he had little trouble bringing himself to taste the strange food. It was slightly warm, chewy, and tasted like lobster paste with a strong dash of red pepper. It was better than he'd expected. When he'd finished eating, Purvey obtained a rather unsatisfactory drink from one of the little rivulets of water which ran down the walls at intervals. Lur had gone to one of his instrument panels and was lying motionless beside it, eye stalks extended and poised over the array of meters. By constant questioning, Purvey learned that the ship he was on was a kind of scout which had been escorting a huge interstellar liner, or battleship. When the accident had occurred, rather than have the mothership stop to give assistance, Lur had radioed that it would be possible for the scout to reach base unaided. If the scout failed to return, however, the mothership would come back and find it. Lur's race only fought wars when attacked by aggressors, but their battleships were very big and powerful. He wandered around the room looking at the alien mechanisms, flapping his arms to keep warm, and trying to decide what was wrong about the place. It was all wrong, of course, being the product of the thinking of an alien life form. But there was another wrongness. Purvey found that he got tired easily. Time dragged by in the monotonous discomfort of the room, and he slept often, crouched in the darkest corner where there was the least mud. This was the place where the explosion had occurred, as was evidenced by the seared metalwork, dented machine housings, and shattered ceiling lights. Purvey liked it best because it was the one place that Lur seemed to avoid. Once, when he was feeling particularly miserable, and Lur was in one of its unresponsive modes, he decided to look for something in which to wrap himself for warmth. His showerproof was heavy with mud, wet and useless as a garment, and he found himself longing for heat in any form. He went to the row of low doors and opened several of them by pressing the white circle, which was a common feature. Inside he found perfectly normal shelves stacked with unmarked boxes of machine parts, which, although beaded with moisture, showed no signs of corrosion. One shelf was loaded with hundreds of blocks of coloured glass or plastic, another with what looked like purple seaweed. A larger door had a red circle on it. Numb with the cold, Purvey opened the door and saw a little room in the centre of which glowed an old-fashioned pot-bellied stove. He was stooping to cross the threshold when it occurred to him that the stove just could not be there, and he jarred to a halt. Something moved near his feet. Just before he jumped back and slammed the door, he had a blurry vision of a fat, slug-like creature rearing up with grey mouth agape. Lur was suddenly conscious again, holding up his communicative leaf. "I see you recognized the Artor this time." "This time?" Purvey said. "Was that the woman I saw?" Lur seemed quite active and alert as the sentences appeared in answer, noticeably quicker than before. The Artor was a very slow-moving, carnivorous animal indigenous to Lur's home planet. It got close to its victims by telepathically invading their minds and controlling the visual centers to make itself appear attractive to them. Apparently Lur had muzzled the Artor, fitted it with something he described as a force field grab, and lowered it to Earth to find a human being in a quiet and lonely place. Purvey, who liked quiet and lonely places, had walked into the trap. As a byproduct of their study of the Artor's ability, Lur's people have been able to develop a device which enabled them to detect and comprehend the thoughts of intelligent animals. Purvey eyed his green companion speculatively, rubbing the stubble on his chin and wondering if he'd picked up another note of warning. On the 5th day, reckoned by his wristwatch, Purvey discovered that Lur had been telling him lies. His feeling that there was a subtle wrongness in the setup finally culminated in the realization that there were two entirely separate sets of controls in the room. The set which was in use, and at which Lur spent most of its time, was grouped along one wall. Every part of it, every short pedestal and housing, was constructed with smooth, brilliant metal, and with the high standard of workmanship that Purvey associated with good pinball machines. The joints in the metal were barely discernible, and the little coloured dots that Lur used instead of numbers were perfect circles and squares etched into the metal. The unused set of controls was scattered over the centre of the floor area, and, in contrast, reminded Purvey of a radio he'd built during a course of remedial training. There were plates which didn't fit, unfilled holes, bolts which bolted nothing, and the coloured markings were roughly shaped blobs of enamel. Scooping away some handfuls of mud, he found that holes had been burned in the floor to let associated cables and pipes pass through. None of these earmarks of a jerried-up experimental rig agreed with Lur's picture of a standard scout ship serving as an operational vessel. But it was hard to see the alien's point in deceiving him over a thing like that. He carefully refrained from thinking about his discovery in case Lur should be able to read his mind. And acting on principle, he began to take an interest in the operation of the ship. His professional instincts told him he might have stumbled onto something good. Another day went by, speeded now by routine. At intervals, Lur drew some of the pink spongy stuff from the locker and pushed it through a slot in the door to the Artor's room. The dangerous little creature seemed to have about the same status as a pet dog in Lur's life, except that it was never allowed out for its equivalent of a walk. Purvey helped himself to the same food any time he was hungry, and found he was growing to like it. It occurred to him that the leafy alien was quite different to what it had been at the start of the journey. In their occasional conversations, for instance, Lur could print up his little messages faster than Purvey could answer them, and it gave him an uncomfortable suspicion that the mobile vegetable was more intelligent than he. Lur's movements had become increasingly more rapid, until he could get around as fast as Purvey, another thing Purvey did not quite like. The only change for the better was that Lur seemed to have got over the strange urge to drape himself over Purvey every time he slept. This made Purvey's rest more comfortable. On the 7th day, it occurred to Purvey that he must be further from Earth than anyone had ever been before. Only 2 manned ships from Earth had reached Mars so far, although there'd been much talk of sending a 3rd ship to see why the first 2 had not returned. And here was Don Purvey, halfway to a star. "Just how far have we come now?" he asked. "Pretty far, eh? How many light years?" "I am not used to calculating in your units," Lur replied. "The best approximation I can give you is 6 light hours." "Light hours?" Purvey shouted. "But that means we've just crossed the orbit of Pluto. You told me the trip would take 15 days. Half that time's gone, and yet we're still in the solar system. What's the game?" Lur didn't answer at once, the first hesitancy for days. Finally, "The journey is in 3 stages. Getting clear of your planetary system takes up half the time. Entering my own home system will take up the other half. That is, traveling in normal space with standard drive. The inter-system jump, using Lurian drive, takes only a few hours." Purvey rubbed his beard and grinned down at Lur. "So that's it," he thought triumphantly. "The new stuff you added to this ship converted it from an ordinary planet hopper to a starship. You invented it, didn't you, Lur? Of course. You just mentioned Lurian drive. You're all alone. There's no big mothership to look for you." The speed of the alien's rush took him by surprise, and Lur had almost reached the Artor's door before Purvey realized what was happening. He ran after it, muttering angrily, but one of Lur's tendrils flicked out and touched the red circle. As the door swung open, Purvey tried to stop, skidded in the mud, and went down heavily on his side. The impact of the fall drove the breath from his lungs. Purvey gasped noisily as he saw the Artor writhe into the room with unexpected speed, pale grey mouth opening and contracting hungrily. Enveloping it were faint changing ghosts of formless objects created as its camouflaging talent reacted on Purvey's whirling brain. He glanced around in panic, saw nothing he could use for a weapon, then scrambled for the row of lockers nearest to him. He opened the door to a compartment and found it was the one full of little glass blocks. The next one contained what appeared to be a complicated valve assembly, and Purvey snatched it from its brackets. The massive piece of metal almost wrenched itself from his grasp as he swung, but he managed to guide it down on the Artor's back. The slug-like body burst open, and the valve sank down into it. A bubbling moan came from the Artor, and the flickering images which had been blurring its outlines abruptly vanished. Leaving his improvised club where it was, Purvey turned in search of Lur. The alien was slithering rapidly towards him with a spiky cactus-like growth extended in front of it. Purvey leapt back, realizing he should have been less squeamish about retrieving his club. He ran across the room, fumbling under his coat until he'd taken off the belt of his trousers. It was of thin, flexible metal. Gripping the buckle tightly, he turned and lashed out with the belt, and luckily connected with several of Lur's upraised eye tendrils. There was a sharp clicking sound as 2 of the severed eyes hit a partition. Swinging the belt with frightened, loathing haste, Purvey struck again and again until all the eyes were gone. After that, the job was comparatively safe, but it took him half an hour, using the strip of torn metal from the wrecked part of the room, to make sure that Lur was dead. "I'll never eat coleslaw again," he vowed to himself as he gathered up the mass of still-twitching herbage and loaded it into the disposal unit. The operation of the ship was, as Purvey had learned by watching Lur, fully automatic. It was a relatively simple matter for him to cancel the instructions under which the ship's computers were steering it out of the solar system. On a little stylized model of a planetary system, in which a row of buttons was ranged out in a line from a glowing hemisphere, he pressed the 3rd one out to designate Earth. He was betting that the ship would home in on the 3rd planet of any system in this way. The fact that the computer was accustomed to Lur's home system made no difference, because even there, if the ship was deactivated for any length of time, the planetary arrangement would have altered when it was put into use again, making it necessary for the ship to scan the heavens afresh and select its destination. It was a first-class spaceship. Purvey congratulated himself, hundreds of years ahead of anything on Earth. For the gadget that made it invisible to radar alone, he'd be able to get more money than he could ever use, and without having to trust his life to any perambulating plant either. When he'd satisfied himself that he could control the ship, he crouched contentedly in his favorite corner and had his first really peaceful sleep in days. On wakening, he found he had a slight headache, which he wrote off as an aftermath of all he'd been through. But it continued to get worse as the hours went by. After a meal and another sleep, he had to admit even to himself that the air in the room had gone stale. Looking around for air conditioning, he found a little grill in the wall below each fan, which meant there was machinery to regenerate the air as it was used up, and that it had stopped working. Sweating a little in spite of the cold, he searched around and discovered a large duct leading into the wall. The duct emerged from a machine housing near the corner where Purvey slept. And going over to it, he discovered a simple, deadly fact. The sides of the housing had been smashed in by the force of the explosion. The air conditioning machine was wrecked. Sobbing with fear, Purvey ran to get tools, then stopped dead. The realization came to him that even if the machinery had been as good as new, he would still be in the same predicament. For when it was working, it had produced carbon dioxide. All at once he had the whole picture. Lur had been a mobile vegetable existing on photosynthesis, converting carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates and giving off oxygen in the process. An explosion had wrecked his carbon dioxide production plant during the experimental flip in the Starship, so he'd obtained a replacement, Don Purvey. That explained Lur's eagerness to lie close to him at first, and the excess of oxygen in the atmosphere at the start of the flight. It also explained why Lur had speeded up so much when Purvey had been around for a while breathing out precious carbon dioxide. It had been keeping Lur alive, and the oxygen Lur had given off in return had been keeping Purvey alive. For the operation of a small spaceship, Lur and Purvey had been a perfect team. And he now realized that it had been a mistake to dissolve the partnership. As before, he was much too late.